So I promised you yesterday that I was going to provide you an example of a personal experience speech. So this is my personal experience speech. For a long time when I was in school, like in elementary school and junior high, I just thought I was dumb. I didn't do well in school. I had trouble focusing. I didn't know how to study, and when I did study, I'd get really discouraged really fast. But I had one class where I had a really memorable experience, and so today I want to tell you about my experience in Ms. Mackenstadt's class. Ms. Mackenstat, I'm going to talk about Ms. Mackenstat herself. I'll talk about the day I got in trouble and the day that I knew the answer. So Ms. Mackenstat taught English and literature, and she was a very tall, imposing-looking woman, broad shoulders. She had a reputation for being kind of mean and short-tempered, and she had a podium in the classroom, and she would walk back and forth when she would lecture with this thing that looked kind of like a cane, but it was actually the leg of a plant stand. And the podium had an indenture in it where she brought it down some years past, and that always stayed with in the classroom. So that was Miss Mackenstat. The second thing I want to talk about is the day I got in trouble. Again, I was a horrible student, and I sat in the very back of the class behind the biggest kid I could find. I was really small, and I just hid behind this big guy. And when we were supposed to be reading, I would have a notebook, like a 3-ring binder. Inside the binder, I would have a comic book, and I would just be reading a comic book. One day, I was cutting up with the kid sitting next to me, and we were both laughing, and I heard Ms. Mackenstat say from the front of the room, "Mr. Owens." And she always called us by our last names. And so she called my name, and I had to lean way out in the aisle to look at her. And she said, "Come up here." And so I stood up and I walked very slowly. The whole class was dead quiet, just looking at me. And she let me get about halfway to the front of the room, and then she said, "No, get your things." And I thought at the time, oh man, I'm getting kicked out of class. I'm going to be in so much trouble. But then when I got to the front of the room, I got in front of her desk, and she had this big oak desk, a bunch of knickknacks and stuff on it. And she just took her arm and swept all that stuff off the side. Not off the desk, but just, to leave a big space. And she put her hand on the desk, and she said, "This is your desk now." And then she didn't even say anything. She just sat back in her chair. We were supposed to be reading, and so she started reading. And pretty soon everybody else started reading, and so I realized what she was saying. I just sat down at the desk. And so we were reading Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. And of course, because I was sitting there, I couldn't do anything but read. And of all things, I got into the book. I liked it. So then, of course, we would read like one class period, then the next class period there would be a discussion, and she would ask us questions. And I remember her asking this question. I don't remember what the question was, but I remember her asking a question, and I remember thinking, oh, that's an easy one. And, of course, all the smart kids sat in the front row, which they were now behind me. And so I'm waiting for one of them to answer. None of them answer. I turn around to look at them, and because I think, why, you guys should know this, right? And then I turn back only to find Ms. Mackenstat just looking right at me. And of course, everybody knows if you don't want to answer the question, you don't make eye contact with the teacher. And I did. And it sort of scared me. And so I was just looking at her, and she said, "Yes, Mr. Owens." And then I answered the question in such a quiet voice, I'll bet nobody behind me heard me. But she heard me, and she just did this little smile and shook her head and said, "Very good, Mr. Owens." So that was my experience with Ms. Mackenstat in her class. I talked about Ms. Mackenstat herself, talked about the day I got in trouble, and then that day that I knew the answer. I would like to tell you that from that day forward, I became a much better student, but I didn't. I went back to my old habits. I didn't know how to study. I didn't try very hard. And that continued through most of my the next few years of my academic career. And in fact, after my freshman year of college, I was put on academic probation. And so then the next year, I thought, I got to get this together. So I really started studying. I started learning how to study better, how to take better notes, and gradually started building better habits. And as my study habits improved and my grades improved, I began to realize I might not be dumb after all. And quite often during that time, as I was beginning to realize that I'm capable of learning, I would think about that day in Ms. Magenstad's class. And it was sort of the early sign that I might be a little smarter than I thought. Thanks for listening.